Okay, our set of notes today, real quick, pretty straightforward set of notes. Just looking at what were some of the reasons that the Americans were able to win. How were they able to pull off this incredible upset? So we've talked in class about how the British really had all the major advantages. They had a bigger, stronger army. They had the best navy in the world. It looked like the British should have won. So what was it that allowed the Americans to win? How did they turn the world upside down, as the phrase was, and pull this huge upset? Well, for one, Washington and the American generals got a lot better. They improved. They learned from their mistakes throughout the war. If you think about early on, especially in New York, Washington made a lot of mistakes planning. Got beat a bunch of times, but Washington was very good at learning from his mistakes. A lot of the British generals didn't really seem to improve much throughout the war. They made some of the same mistakes repeatedly, so that worked out in the Americans' favor. Communication problems were a big issue for the British, especially at Saratoga. So if you remember at Saratoga, that was when 3 British armies were supposed to meet up and trap an American army. Well, because of communication problems, only one of the British armies showed up. And so that British army ended up getting captured. And so that proved to be very problematic for the British. Also after Saratoga, we know that that was an important turning point because the French came and helped us out at a very important time. Washington was able to move his armies and his troops more quickly than the British were. This particularly helped at Yorktown, right? As Washington was able to trap Cornwallis, he was able to move his troops into positions that kept the British pinned up and didn't allow them to escape. A lot of that had to do with the fact that the Americans just knew the land better, right? That this was our home soil, our home turf. And so we knew it very well, whereas the British didn't. And so we could move our troops usually much more quickly than the British could. Supplying a big army was a big problem for the British. They had the supplies, they had the money, they had the resources, but they had a very large army. And so it takes a lot of goods to feed a large army. It takes a lot of goods to clothe a large army. It costs a lot. So even though they had a lot of money and they were able to do it, it was still a big problem. Part of the reason it was a big problem was because they couldn't just bring over more guns or bring over more clothes at the drop of a hat. It took 2 months to send things across the ocean. And every single man in the army used 1/3 of a ton of food per year. So multiply that by the thousands and thousands of soldiers that the British had fighting in the war, and you've got yourself a pretty big problem. How are you going to keep the army fed? How are you going to keep them clothed and supplied when it costs a lot and it takes a really long time to get the goods and the food across the ocean to the army? The war was not very popular in Britain. I would say early on, it was not necessarily popular, but it was less unpopular. And the longer it went on, the less popular it became. So you have to remember, right, Lexington and Concord take place in 1775. The Battle of Yorktown is in 1781. That's 6 years. And so the longer this war drags on, the less popular it becomes in England. And so the members of the British government in Parliament are hearing it from people in England, that they're tired of this war, they're tired of Britain spending money on it, they want it to be over. And the Americans were pretty smart when it came to the tactics that they used. For example, using guerrilla warfare. They knew that they were the underdogs. The Americans knew that most of the time they were not going to be a good match for the British on an open field. So they used guerrilla warfare. They used sharpshooters. They used the high ground on battlefields very, very well, and were able to sort of keep the British off balance a lot of times. So these are 8 different ways that the Americans were able to overcome the odds and defeat the strongest army in the world in order to win their independence.